What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in this video, I'm going to be going through my Week 13 top 36 wide receivers, also splitting these wide receivers up into tiers. Already posted the top 36 running backs if you haven't checked those out, but let's just dive right into the rankings. Going to start off with tier 1. We're definitely missing a few of the typical, guys in the tier 1 area. This week, we're going to have 5 wide receivers. It's going to be Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Keenan Allen, CeeDee Lamb, and A.J. Brown. We do have a few of these guys dealing with injuries. Tyreek Hill in his hand, I do think he'll be fine. Keenan Allen popped up with a quad injury. We'll see how that looks. A little bit more concerning just due to his age, and if you remember last year, missed a lot of time, but as of right now, I wouldn't be panicking a ton. And then A.J. Brown dealing with the thigh. If those guys are good to go, they're going to be locked into your fantasy football lineups. Now looking at the tier 2 wide receivers, wide receiver 6 through wide receiver 10, going to start it off with Mike Evans. Not a great matchup here against the Panthers, but Mike Evans just keeps on producing. He continues to be their top red zone option, so I like him here as a mid-tier wide receiver 1. Then I'm rolling with Michael Pittman. Super consistent week to week, is consistently commanding a lot of volume, and this Colts offense just continues to put up a decent number of points. After Pittman, we're going with Brandon Ayuk. This Eagles secondary has definitely been a little bit suspect. Ayuk has been a great fantasy option this season. After Ayuk, we're going to go with Tank Dell. He popped up on the injury report with a calf injury, assuming he's good to go. I actually like him here as a top 10 wide receiver. Honestly, super impressive for someone with his type of draft capital to be making this type of impact in his rookie season. Him and CJ Stroud are going to be a great duo moving forward. So I like him here, just continues to ball out. Behind Tank Dell, I have Jalen Waddle. Love the matchup here against the Commanders. I think he definitely belongs in tier 2. Now looking at tier 3, these are going to be your back end wide receiver 1s to your mid-tier wide receiver 2s. Going to start it off with Devonta Smith going up against the 49ers. Probably the best game of the week there, Eagles-Niners. I like him as the nice, wide receiver 2 for the Eagles here, giving you some solid games as of late. 49ers have kind of been an in-between matchup for opposing wide receivers, so not super worried either way. He's also banged up, dealing with a knee injury. Assuming he's good to go, this right, have him slotted in. My wide receiver 12 is going to be Jamar Chase. Obviously, he takes a hit with the Burrow injury. Going up against the Jaguars, I still think Chase will be fine, but he's just not going to have that crazy high-end ceiling that you'd see if Joe Burrow was healthy. Then I'm going to have Calvin Ridley, definitely a massive riser over the last couple of weeks. As long as Zay Jones has been in the lineup, Calvin Ridley has been a monster for fantasy. So as long as that continues, I'm going to continue to ride the hot hand here with Ridley. After Ridley, we're going to have Deebo Samuel. Talked about that suspect Eagles secondary. Deebo hasn't quite been as consistent as Brandon Ayuk, but he's still a fine option coming off a solid game on Thanksgiving. Then after Deebo, we're going to go with Nico Collins. Just like Tank Dell, Nico Collins continues to produce. Going up against the Broncos, really like having pieces of this Texans offense, and especially those 2 wide receivers. Then we're going to go back-to-back Rams wideouts, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua. They both draw a tough matchup here against the Browns, but I think potentially both of these guys, I think at least one of them, are going to get back on track. Both have been kind of underwhelming, especially as of late, but I think they're just too talented to continue to struggle here. So I'm fine, throwing those guys in as mid-tier wide receiver 2s. And then after them, to wrap up tier 3, I'm going to go with Garrett Wilson. Despite the terrible quarterback play, he has been wildly consistent, I think aside from like one dud game, I believe in week 11. But outside of that, Garrett Wilson has been a very reliable option. They continue to force feed him, and it honestly just makes me a little bit sad because if he had Rodgers this season, he really could be competing for like the high-end wide receiver 1 finish. I do think he could have been like a 20-plus point per game guy with some solid quarterback play. But he's going to wrap up tier 3. Looking at tier 4, pretty large tier here. Going to start it off with Adam Thielen. Now, Thielen has definitely been disappointing over the last like 5-ish weeks. He was on that crazy stretch, was like a high-end wide receiver 1. Has not been able to match that pretty much like since the bye week, but he's still been fine. He's still commanding volume, 10-plus targets in 3 of his last 5 games. So I think he's fine here as like a mid-tier wide receiver 2, especially in a week with a lot of buys. Then we're going to go with Marquise Brown. Had a nice bounce-back game after 2 rough ones with Kyler. Not super scared of this Steelers defense, so I like Hollywood here as a back-end wide receiver 2. Then I'm going to go with Christian Kirk. Talked about Calvin Ridley having really nice splits with Zay Jones. Kirk has struggled a little bit, but I definitely think he's still relevant. Then we're going to go with Terry McLaurin. Hasn't been great over the last few weeks. but I do think they're probably going to need to put up points against this Dolphins defense. I think the Dolphins are going to have a field day here going up against the Commanders. Then we're going to go with Deontay Johnson. He struggled as of late, but he still commands volume. I like the matchup here against the Cardinals, and I do think he's the better option over George Pickens just based on the volume. I think this is a nice opportunity for him to kind of get right here. Then I'm going to go with Josh Downs. I've been very high on Downs all season long. First game back off the bye week, he had like the 2 games where he was limited with injury. Clearly does not seem to be limited anymore. Commanded 12 targets. That's a ton of volume. I like the matchup here against this Titans secondary. Then I'm going to have back-to-back Seahawks wide receivers with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I think they've kind of fallen into that wide receiver 3 territory at this point. Both guys are drawing tough matchups here against the Cowboys. Then I'm going to have Rashee Rice. Had a huge breakout game in Week 12. After a disappointing post-bye game in Week 11, it was good to see him lead this team in terms of route participation. He capitalized on it. I think he has to be locked in their top wide receiver rest of season and could end up being a league winner down the stretch as like a very, very reliable wide receiver 2 play. Now pivoting into tier 5, we're actually going to have another rookie wide receiver here after Rashee Rice. It's going to be Demario Douglas. Now, his situation seems to be up in the air at this point. So he originally left the Week 12 game with a head injury, did not return. Then after the game, they were saying it wasn't a concussion. Now I do believe he's in concussion protocol. So there's no guarantee he plays this week. If he does, though, I really like this matchup here for the Chargers. He's been operating as their clear-cut wide receiver 1 over the last few weeks. He consistently is commanding volume. So if he's healthy, I do really like him this week. Then we're going to go with Courtland Sutton. One of these guys who's definitely been propped up by his touchdowns, but he clearly is a strong red zone threat. Russell Wilson's looking better, even if the volume isn't there. So I think Sutton's like a fine mid-tier wide receiver 3. Behind Sutton, we're going to go with D-Hop. Struggled as of late. Don't hate the matchup here against the Colts. This could be a decent opportunity for Will Levis. Not an overly tough matchup, but D-Hop's definitely struggled a little bit since like that huge game him and Will Levis had. After D-Hop, we're going with Drake London. It seems like it's the same story here with London. Obviously, the quarterback play isn't going to be top tier, but he's coming off a solid game. Never going to be a super high volume guy just on this offense and the number of pass attempts they're throwing, but a fine wide receiver 3. Then I'm going to have Jaden Reed going up against the Chiefs. Also have Christian Watson in this tier as my wide receiver 34. I do slightly prefer Jaden Reed. The Chiefs have done a good job of taking away opposing teams' wide receiver 1. Jaden Reed's getting some creative usage, getting some carries in there. Really impressive fantasy production over the last 3 weeks. I have T. Higgins sandwiched between those 2 Packers wide receivers. Obviously, the Joe Burrow injury is tough. There's no guarantee that Higgins plays this week, but if he does, this is where I'd have him slotted in. Christian Watson really got his first pretty much boom game of the season last week. It was good to see. I was really high on him heading into the season. I thought he had a lot of upside. We'll see if he can keep that rolling here against the Chiefs. Then we're going to wrap it up with kind of, I guess, 2 wide receiver 2s that have maybe been a little bit disappointing as of late. George Pickens and Chris Godwin. Since Deontay's come off of IR, those big splash plays just haven't really been there. He could potentially get one of those against this Cardinals defense, though. And then wrapping it up with Chris Godwin, I'm really surprised in how big the difference is between Mike Evans and Chris Godwin's fantasy production this season. Heading into the year, I really thought that Baker would be better for Chris Godwin. It was his second year off the ACL tear. It's just not played out that way. Mike Evans has been the clear top option. Godwin has struggled fantasy-wise over the last few weeks. I still think he's a very talented wide receiver, but he's going to wrap it up here as my wide receiver 36. Definitely a lot of fantasy-relevant wide receivers on bye, so maybe getting a little bit thin towards the end of these rankings. Not a ton of depth, especially outside like the top 36, but this is what we're looking at this week. If you guys have any fantasy questions, drop them down below. Like I said at the top, running backs are already posted. My start sits were done, earlier on. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.